The royal moon ball happened only once each year, which meant every noble in the kingdom treated it like the most important night of their lives. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand hall. Silver banners hung from vaulted ceilings. Music drifted through the palace like a living thing. Couples glided across polished marble floors, while servants carried trays of sparkling wine through the crowd. Everything looked perfect. Everything sounded perfect. Everything felt perfect until Alpha Adrian Thornvale asked Willow Everhart to dance. The invitation itself wasn't unusual. Adrian was young, charming, well-respected. Several ladies had spent the evening hoping he would choose them. Instead, he stopped in front of Willow. The sight immediately attracted attention, because Willow attracted attention everywhere she went. Not intentionally, she simply possessed that kind of presence. Confident without arrogance, intelligent without pretension, graceful without trying. Most people liked her, some admired her. A few were quietly intimidated by her. Adrian smiled and offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" Willow looked surprised, then amused. Finally, she accepted. "I'd be delighted." The orchestra launched into a waltz. The pair joined the dancers. Conversation resumed throughout the ballroom, at least for everyone except one person. Seated beside the royal throne, Alpha King Cassian Nightfang stopped listening entirely. The minister speaking beside him noticed first. "Your Majesty." No response. Cassian's gaze remained fixed on the dance floor. More specifically, on Willow. The minister followed his line of sight, then wisely stopped talking, because he suddenly understood. Unfortunately, several other people understood too. A duchess glanced toward the throne, then toward the dancers, then smiled knowingly. A council member quietly hid a laugh behind his glass. Even the royal guards exchanged brief looks. The signs were becoming difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, Cassian remained completely unaware that half the ballroom was studying him. His attention never left Willow. She looked happy, relaxed, comfortable. The sight should not have bothered him. Instead, it irritated him immensely, especially when she laughed. The sound floated across the room. Light, warm, effortless. Adrian said something else. Willow laughed again. Several dancers smiled at the exchange. Cassian did not. His wine sat untouched beside him. His conversation had ended several minutes ago. The evening continued moving forward. Only the Alpha King seemed stuck. Then Adrian leaned slightly closer while guiding Willow through a turn. Whatever he said earned another smile. That was enough. Cassian stood. The movement wasn't dramatic. He didn't slam anything, didn't raise his voice, didn't make a scene. Yet the effect was immediate. Nearby conversations died. Several nobles straightened. The atmosphere shifted, because every wolf in the room felt it. The moment an alpha made a decision. Slowly, deliberately, Alpha King Cassian Nightfang stepped away from the throne, then started walking toward the dance floor. And suddenly, the entire ballroom forgot how to breathe. The truly frustrating part was that none of this should have surprised anyone, especially not Cassian. For 3 years, the Alpha King had built an entire routine around Willow Everhart, and somehow convinced himself it meant absolutely nothing. The lie might have worked if nobody had been paying attention. Unfortunately, everyone had. Willow worked closely with the crown. Officially, she served as the kingdom's director of civic affairs. Unofficially, she solved problems nobody else could. When a flood destroyed farming villages in the south, Willow organized relief efforts before the council finished arguing about funding. When diplomatic guests arrived unexpectedly, Willow somehow transformed potential disasters into successful negotiations. When disputes erupted between noble houses, she often resolved them before they reached the throne. People trusted her, not because she held power, because she earned respect. Again and again, Cassian noticed all of it, every accomplishment, every success, every impossible situation she somehow managed to fix. The problem was that he noticed far more than that. He noticed her favorite tea, the book she borrowed from the royal library, the way she tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear while reading reports, the fact that she skipped lunch whenever she became absorbed in work, information no king should reasonably possess. Yet somehow he did. The palace staff found this deeply entertaining, especially because Cassian remained completely oblivious to his own behavior. One winter morning, Willow mentioned wanting additional funding for a rural school program. 2 days later, the budget mysteriously appeared. Another time, she casually commented that the East Garden roses looked beautiful that season. Cassian spent the following week conducting inspections near those same gardens. Daily, the gardeners nearly injured themselves trying not to laugh. His advisor eventually stopped pretending. "You're doing it again." Cassian looked up from a document. "Doing what?" "Following Willow around." The king frowned. "I am not." The advisor pointed toward the window. Outside, Willow crossed the palace courtyard. Coincidentally, Cassian's office had been relocated 3 times in 6 months. Each move somehow brought him closer to Willow's workspaces. Neither man mentioned that. The evidence felt overwhelming enough already. Meanwhile, Willow remained blissfully unaware. To her, the Alpha King was simply a trusted colleague, a respected ruler, occasionally difficult, frequently stubborn, entirely professional. She never questioned why he always seemed nearby, never wondered why her projects received unusually quick approval, never noticed the lingering glances, or perhaps she did, and simply chose not to mention it. The possibility occasionally haunted him. 3 years passed this way. 3 years of unfinished conversations, missed opportunities, and increasingly obvious affection. The entire kingdom watched the situation unfold with growing disbelief. Even foreign ambassadors commented on it. One famously asked whether the Alpha King required written instructions. Cassian was not amused. Then Alpha Adrian Thornvale arrived in the capital. Unlike Cassian, Adrian possessed a remarkable quality. He recognized what he wanted, and he wasn't afraid to pursue it. 3 weeks later, he walked into the royal moon ball, spotted Willow across the room, and did something the Alpha King had failed to do for 3 years. He asked her to dance. Alpha Adrian Thornvale became a problem almost immediately. Not because he was arrogant, not because he was reckless, and certainly not because he lacked manners. The problem was exactly the opposite. Adrian was likable, painfully likable. The Alpha ruled a prosperous Western territory known for trade, diplomacy, and stability. He was intelligent without being condescending, confident without being overbearing, and charming without appearing rehearsed. In short, he was everything Cassian wished he could dislike. Unfortunately, there was nothing to dislike. The first time Adrian met Willow was during a council reception. Most nobles spent the evening trying to impress important people. Adrian spent the evening actually talking to them. At some point, he found himself standing beside Willow near the refreshment tables. They spoke for nearly an hour. The next day, he invited her to dinner. She accepted. Cassian heard about it entirely by accident, or so he claimed. The palace staff strongly disagreed. 2 weeks later, Adrian invited Willow horseback riding through the royal hunting grounds. She accepted again. Cassian learned this information while reviewing military reports. The report had absolutely nothing to do with horseback riding. Yet somehow, the information found him anyway. A coincidence, according to him. A conspiracy, according to his advisor. The advisor was probably correct. The worst part wasn't the invitations. It was how naturally Willow seemed to enjoy Adrian's company. The two laughed easily together, shared stories, debated politics, discussed literature. They looked comfortable. The sight bothered Cassian more than it should have, especially because Adrian wasn't stealing anything. He was simply doing what normal people did when they liked someone, something Cassian had spent 3 years avoiding. The realization became impossible to ignore. Every dinner invitation, every conversation, every shared smile. Adrian pursued opportunities. Cassian collected regrets. One evening, the royal advisor finally lost patience. The older wolf closed a document and stared directly at the king. "You know what your problem is?" Cassian didn't look up. "No, you're waiting for certainty." The answer immediately irritated him, mostly because it felt accurate. The advisor continued, "You keep acting like you'll eventually receive some magical sign." Silence. Meanwhile, another alpha is actually doing something. Cassian frowned. The conversation ended there, but the words remained, because deep down, he understood the truth. He wasn't afraid of rejection. He was afraid of change. As long as he remained silent, nothing could go wrong. No embarrassing confessions, no awkward conversations, no heartbreak. Unfortunately, no future either. Then came the royal moon ball, the largest social event of the year, and the moment everything finally collapsed. Cassian watched from beside the throne, watched Adrian approach Willow, watched her smile, watched her accept the invitation, then watched them move together across the dance floor. The sight felt strangely unbearable, yet he remained seated for a while. Then Adrian leaned closer during the dance, whispered something, and Willow blushed, a genuine blush, soft pink coloring her cheeks beneath the ballroom lights. The reaction lasted only seconds. It was enough, because in that moment, Alpha King Cassian Nightfang realized he had officially run out of time. The orchestra continued playing. The dancers continued moving. The ballroom continued breathing. At least everyone except Cassian, because the moment Willow blushed, something inside him snapped. Not violently, not dramatically, simply, completely. For 3 years, he had convinced himself he was being reasonable, patient, careful. 3 years of waiting for the perfect opportunity, the perfect moment, the perfect certainty. Now, another alpha was dancing with Willow in the center of the ballroom, while Cassian sat beside his throne like an idiot. The realization was not pleasant. Across the dance floor, Adrian guided Willow through another turn. She looked happy, relaxed, comfortable, exactly as she should. That somehow made everything worse, because Cassian couldn't find a single legitimate reason to interfere. Adrian wasn't doing anything wrong. Willow wasn't doing anything wrong. The only person responsible for the situation was him. Unfortunately, self-awareness did absolutely nothing to improve his mood. Nearby, his advisor slowly lowered a wine glass. The older wolf recognized danger when he saw it. Not physical danger, social danger, the most entertaining kind. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. Cassian ignored him. "Whatever you're considering, still nothing." The advisor sighed, because he knew that expression. The stubborn one, the expression that appeared immediately before terrible decisions. And unfortunately, Cassian was already standing. The movement rippled through the ballroom. Not loudly, not obviously, yet instantly. Nobles noticed, servants noticed, musicians noticed. Even several dancers missed steps while watching, because the Alpha King had just abandoned the throne during the most important social event of the year, and he was walking with purpose toward the dance floor, toward Willow, toward disaster. Conversations died one after another. The effect spread across the room like a wave. People nudged companions. Guests exchanged looks. Several noblewomen looked delighted. One elderly duchess openly grinned. The royal advisor considered leaving the country. Meanwhile, Cassian continued forward. The crowd parted automatically. No commands required. No explanation necessary. People simply moved. Every step increased the tension. Every step fueled speculation. By the time he reached the edge of the dance floor, half the ballroom had stopped pretending to focus on anything else. Even the orchestra seemed uncertain. The musicians continued playing. Barely. Willow noticed him first. Her smile faded slightly. Not from fear, from confusion. Cassian almost stopped. Almost. Then Adrian noticed him too. The Western Alpha immediately understood something was wrong. His eyebrows rose. Slowly. Knowingly. The reaction irritated Cassian more than it should have. The song continued. The dancers rotated, and suddenly Cassian stood directly beside them, close enough to interrupt, close enough to commit, close enough to make retreat impossible. The ballroom held its collective breath. Adrian wisely said nothing. Willow waited. The music played on. For one long second, nobody moved. Then Cassian extended his hand toward her. A king. A fool. Possibly both. And in a voice that sounded far calmer than he felt, he asked the question that would be discussed throughout the kingdom for years. "May I cut in?" The words were polite. The tone, absolutely, was not. Silence. Complete. Absolute. The orchestra continued playing, but nobody seemed to hear it anymore. Every noble in the ballroom stared at the same scene. The Alpha King, Willow Everhart, and Alpha Adrian Thornvale, who suddenly found himself standing in the middle of a situation he wanted no part of. Cassian's hand remained extended. Waiting, the invitation seemed simple enough. Under normal circumstances, Willow would have accepted immediately. These were not normal circumstances. Instead, she looked at his hand, then at him, then back at his hand again. The pause lasted only seconds. It felt much longer. Finally, she smiled, not warmly, not coldly, curiously, as though she had discovered an especially interesting puzzle. The expression immediately made Cassian nervous. A rare occurrence. "Your Majesty," she said. The title sounded suspiciously formal. Cassian recognized danger. Too late. "You've never asked me to dance before." The ballroom froze. If possible, even harder than before, because she was right. Painfully. Embarrassingly. Publicly right. Cassian opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Several nearby nobles suddenly became fascinated by the ceiling. Others looked ready to burst into laughter. The royal advisor quietly covered his face. Willow continued, calmly, patiently, like someone presenting evidence in court. "I've attended every moonball for 3 years." Cassian remained silent. "You've attended every moonball too." Still silence. Her smile widened slightly, the kind that warned intelligent people to retreat. Unfortunately, it was too late for that. "And somehow," she continued, "you never once asked me to dance." A few gasps echoed through the room. Not because Willow was being rude, because she was being accurate. The worst kind of accurate. Across from them, Adrian took one discreet step backward, then another. The Western alpha possessed excellent survival instincts. Cassian envied him. Willow folded her arms. A gesture Cassian knew very well. It usually meant someone was about to learn an important lesson. Unfortunately, the someone was him. 3 years. The words landed softly, like arrows. 3 years of festivals. Another pause. 3 years of banquets. More silence. 3 years of opportunities. The ballroom watched, completely captivated. No scandal in recent memory had been nearly this entertaining. Because this wasn't politics. This wasn't power. This was a king being held accountable, publicly, and there wasn't a single thing he could do about it. Finally, Willow tilted her head slightly. Her expression softened, just enough, because beneath the frustration, there was genuine confusion, a question she clearly wanted answered, not as an official, not as a colleague, as a woman. So why now? The words settled heavily between them. Simple, direct, impossible to avoid. Cassian looked at her, really looked at her. The woman he'd spent 3 years finding excuses to stand beside. The woman who somehow occupied his thoughts during council meetings, military briefings, and diplomatic negotiations. The woman currently waiting for an answer. And suddenly, he realized something terrifying. Every person in the ballroom already knew the truth, including Adrian, including his advisor, including Willow. The only person who spent 3 years pretending not to understand was him. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. The ballroom waited. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the orchestra had stopped playing. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a servant nearly dropped a tray. The sound echoed through the silence. Nobody cared. Every eye remained fixed on the same 2 people, Willow, and the Alpha King who looked increasingly trapped by a question he should have answered years ago. So why now? Her words lingered between them. Simple, honest, impossible to escape. For a moment, Cassian considered giving a diplomatic answer. Something careful, something polished. A response suitable for a king. Then, he looked around the ballroom, at the hundreds of people watching, at Adrian standing several feet away, at Willow waiting patiently. And suddenly, the idea felt ridiculous. Diplomacy caused this problem. 3 years of caution caused this problem. 3 years of silence caused this problem. Perhaps honesty was worth trying instead. A short laugh escaped him. Unexpected, defeated. The kind of laugh people make when they finally stop pretending. Several nobles exchanged surprised looks. Cassian rarely laughed at himself. Tonight seemed full of unusual decisions. Slowly, he lowered his hand, not because he was retreating, because he finally understood that a dance wasn't the issue. The truth was, when he spoke, his voice carried easily through the ballroom. No royal authority, no rehearsed speeches, just honesty. For once, because watching another alpha dance with you was apparently the only thing stupid enough to make me admit I don't want anyone else doing it. Silence, absolute silence. The confession hung in the air. Then chaos exploded. Gasps erupted across the room. Several noblewomen immediately began whispering. One elderly duchess clapped both hands together and declared, "Finally." Her husband looked embarrassed. The duchess did not. A young count nearly dropped his wine. 2 servants exchanged triumphant looks. The royal advisor closed his eyes, not because he was shocked, because he had predicted this exact outcome 2 years ago. Across the ballroom, Adrian rubbed a hand across his face, then laughed, actually laughed. The sound broke some of the tension, because unlike everyone else, Adrian seemed relieved, as though someone had finally solved a problem that had become increasingly obvious. Meanwhile, Willow simply stared. The reaction surprised Cassian. He expected anger, amusement, possibly murder. Instead, she looked stunned, not by the confession itself, by the sincerity behind it, the honesty, the complete lack of royal performance. For years, she watched Cassian avoid conversations exactly like this one. Now he stood before the entire kingdom, admitting the truth, messily, publicly, without excuses. The realization left her unexpectedly speechless. The ballroom slowly settled. Whispers continued. Excitement lingered. Nobody looked away, because despite the confession, one important detail remained unresolved. Willow still hadn't answered. Cassian had finally admitted the truth. 3 years late, in front of several hundred witnesses, the kingdom had received its scandal. The nobles had received their entertainment. The Alpha King had received his humiliation. Now, everyone waited for the only opinion that actually mattered. Willow's. And judging by the thoughtful look in her eyes, she wasn't about to make it easy for him. The ballroom remained silent. Not because people lacked opinions. Quite the opposite. Everyone had opinions, hundreds of them. The problem was that nobody dared interrupt. After all, the Alpha King had just confessed his feelings in front of half the kingdom. The appropriate response was apparently to stare. Willow was staring too, though for very different reasons. Cassian's confession had surprised her. Not because she never suspected his feelings. She had, more than once. The problem was that suspicion and confirmation were very different things, especially when the confirmation arrived in the middle of a ballroom, with several hundred witnesses and one abandoned dance partner. Speaking of which, Adrian quietly lifted his wine glass from a passing tray, then retreated another few steps. A wise decision. Willow almost laughed. Instead, she focused on the man standing in front of her. Cassian looked unusually vulnerable. The sight felt strange. Kings weren't supposed to look uncertain. They certainly weren't supposed to look hopeful. Yet somehow, he managed both. For a brief moment, she considered taking his hand. The easy path. The romantic path. The path everyone in the ballroom desperately wanted. Then she remembered 3 years. 3 long years, and lowered her arms. That's a nice confession. Several nobles winced. Cassian looked alarmed. Willow continued. But that's all it is. The words landed heavily, because they were true. A confession explained the past. It didn't fix it. The Alpha King frowned slightly. What does that mean? Willow raised an eyebrow. The reaction alone answered the question. Still, she explained, it means you don't get credit for finally saying something you should have said years ago. The ballroom collectively held its breath. Cassian absorbed the criticism quietly. No defensiveness, no arguments, which was probably wise. Willow stepped closer, not angrily, honestly. You had 3 years. Silence. 3 years to ask me to dinner. Another pause. 3 years to ask me to dance. The final observation drew nervous laughter from several guests. Because she wasn't wrong, not even slightly. Cassian rubbed a hand across the back of his neck, a gesture rarely seen in public. The movement looked surprisingly human, almost boyish. I know. The answer surprised her. Most powerful men rushed to defend themselves. Cassian didn't. Instead, he nodded, slowly, accepting responsibility. I know. The repeated admission carried genuine regret. For the first time, Willow saw how much he meant it. Not the confession. The apology hidden beneath it. The realization softened something inside her. Only a little, but enough. Cassian noticed immediately. Hope flickered across his expression. Dangerous hope, the kind that encouraged foolish optimism. Willow pointed at him. "Don't look so relieved." The ballroom laughed, even Cassian. A little. The tension eased slightly. Then Willow grew serious again. "Feelings aren't enough." Silence returned. "Not anymore." Cassian met her gaze, understanding gradually appearing, because this wasn't about whether she cared for him. It was about trust, effort, consistency, everything that should have happened before tonight. Finally, Willow exhaled, then offered him something far more valuable than immediate forgiveness. A chance, one chance. Not because he was king, because he was finally acting like a man willing to earn what he wanted. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The ballroom waited. The nobles waited. Even the musicians seemed uncertain whether they should start playing again. Willow looked at Cassian. Cassian looked at Willow. And somewhere, in the corner, Adrian looked increasingly pleased that he was no longer involved. Finally, Willow sighed. The sound carried amusement more than frustration. "You realize the entire kingdom is watching." Cassian glanced around. Hundreds of faces immediately pretended not to be staring. The performance was terrible. Willow laughed. The tension loosened instantly. For the first time all evening, the situation felt less like a public spectacle and more like two people having an honest conversation. Cassian offered his hand again. This time, he didn't interrupt a dance. He asked, patiently, waiting for her decision. Willow studied him. The stubborn king, the infuriating man, the person who had spent 3 years finding excuses to stand near her, while somehow never finding the courage to say why. Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. And yet, her gaze softened, because despite everything, she knew one thing. He was trying, really trying. Perhaps for the first time, slowly, she placed her hand in his. The ballroom erupted. Cheers echoed through the hall. Several noblewomen openly applauded. The elderly duchess from earlier looked ready to declare a national holiday. The musicians scrambled to resume playing. Within moments, a new waltz filled the ballroom. Cassian guided Willow onto the dance floor. This time, nobody interrupted. Nobody interfered. The crowd gave them space. The way people instinctively moved aside, for history. For a while, they danced in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, the kind that comes after something important has finally been said. Eventually, Willow spoke. "You know, this would have been much less dramatic 3 years ago." Cassian winced. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" "No." The answer arrived immediately. He laughed. A genuine laugh. The sound surprised both of them. Then his expression softened. "I'm sorry." Willow looked up. He wasn't joking anymore. "I should have said something sooner." The honesty settled between them. No excuses, no explanations, just truth. Willow appreciated that more than she expected. After a moment, she nodded. "I know." The simple response felt like forgiveness. Or at least the beginning of it. Around them, the ballroom gradually returned to life. Conversations resumed. Music swelled. People danced again. Yet somehow the center of the room still belonged to them. Cassian glanced down at her. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" Willow smiled. "Please do." His expression turned resigned. "I thought I was being subtle." She stared. Then burst out laughing. The reaction drew curious looks from nearby dancers. Cassian looked offended. "You weren't?" "I know that now." Everyone knew. His shoulders slumped. Apparently, Willow laughed harder. And for the first time in years, everything felt unexpectedly simple. No unspoken tension. No unfinished conversations. No wondering what might happen. Just two people, finally standing where they should have been all along. The song continued. The dance floor turned, and neither of them seemed particularly interested in letting go. Years later, people still talked about the moon ball, not the trade agreements announced that evening, not the noble alliances negotiated between dances, and certainly not the menu. Nobody remembered the menu. What they remembered was the moment the Alpha King crossed the ballroom. The story became legendary. Each retelling grew slightly more dramatic. According to some versions, Cassian pushed through the crowd like a warrior entering battle. Others claimed the orchestra stopped playing out of fear. One particularly ridiculous version insisted lightning struck the palace roof the moment Willow accepted his hand. None of those things happened. The truth was far simpler and far more embarrassing. Cassian had simply grown tired of lying to himself. "Tell them the real story." Willow's voice carried across the palace terrace. Cassian looked up from the book he wasn't reading. Several young nobles sat nearby, eagerly waiting for details. The newer generation adored hearing the tale, mostly because they enjoyed discovering that powerful people could be idiots too. The Alpha King sighed. "I dislike this story. You love this story. I tolerate this story." Willow laughed. After 5 years of marriage, she had become exceptionally skilled at translating Cassian. The young nobles exchanged amused looks. One finally gathered enough courage to ask, "Is it true you interrupted another Alpha's dance?" Cassian groaned. "It sounds much worse when you say it that way." Because it was worse, Willow accepted a cup of tea from a servant. The servant immediately lingered, pretending not to listen, exactly the way palace servants always did. Cassian noticed. He ignored it. Some traditions couldn't be stopped. Across the garden, children played among flowering hedges. Life had changed considerably since that famous ball. Adrian Thornvale eventually married a clever diplomat from the Western Territories. They remained friends, mostly because Adrian never missed opportunities to tease Cassian about that night. Willow considered this deeply deserved. Meanwhile, the kingdom continued thriving. Projects expanded, communities prospered, and somehow the future that once seemed uncertain became wonderfully ordinary. The realization still amazed Cassian sometimes, not because of the throne, because of Willow, the woman who challenged him, questioned him, refused to make anything easy, and somehow made his life better anyway. The young nobles waited expectantly, clearly hoping for wisdom. Unfortunately, they asked the wrong person. Willow rescued the conversation. As usual, the lesson isn't about jealousy. Several heads tilted. It isn't. She shook her head. No. The evening breeze carried the scent of roses through the garden. For a moment, everyone listened, even Cassian. The lesson is that feelings don't matter much if you never act on them. Silence settled gently over the terrace. Then she smiled, looking directly at her husband. Cassian smiled back, because after all these years, he finally understood. Love didn't become real the day he noticed Willow, or the day he fell for her, or even the day he crossed the ballroom. Love became real the moment he stopped waiting for certainty and chose to risk everything for a chance. And judging by the life they'd built together, it was the best decision he ever made.